This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 292, New Relic. Welcome to Talking Drupal. I'm Stephen Cross, and today we're joined by David Needham to learn about the basics of New Relic. Welcome, David.
Hey, Stephen. How are you doing?
Good. David is a developer advocate at Pantheon, where he focuses on developer education and community engagement, which I'm interested to learn about. He's also active in the Drupal community. If you take a look at his .org profile, you can see in our show notes. David also blogs about productivity and speaks at Drupal conferences. When not on Talking Drupal, which is other than today, you can find him biking and playing board games with his family in Champaign, Illinois. Welcome.
Cool. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So joining me as usual also is Nick Laughlin. Nick, what's up with you?
Good afternoon, everybody. So this week, actually last night, I did a fun little side project. So I have, we've got a couple of friends down in Colombia that started a business early last year, and they put everything on pause because of coronavirus. And recently, I think in the last week or so, they found out that they had to build a website just for some compliance reasons. They had to build it very quickly to avoid some fines because they had to advertise certain information publicly. And so they know I do websites. So they asked me if I could build a very quick site. It didn't have to look, just had to have a couple of sentences about the business and then their financial disclosure statement. So just to get something up so they could avoid the fines, I decided to do a static HTML site on Netlify. And I didn't even use Jekyll or anything. Like, they literally just needed something up in, a couple of hours. So I built it straight through Netlify. And I mean, Netlify is fast, but building a static HTML site through Netlify, you push and it builds in like half a second.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you push and the code is there because there's no build process. It's just straight CSS and HTML. Now, over the next week or so, I am going to research, I think, Jekyll and maybe a couple of things because, I've been thinking about, I've got a couple of clients that are still in Drupal 7 and they're, small businesses with just kind of, marketing sites that have 3 or 4 pages. And, it isn't really going to make sense for my business or theirs probably to move to Drupal 8 or Drupal 9. So one thing I'm offering them is to help migrate them to like Wix or something like that. But
Nick, have you considered looking at like Tome for Drupal?
Yeah, the problem with that is it stays on Drupal 7, which means, and I don't really.
No. What do you mean?
Has Tome been?
Yeah,
Tome is a Drupal 7 only module, unless they recently updated it.
No, it's Drupal 8.
Wait, am I confusing that with another?
I think you are. Yeah, so you could build a Drupal site in Drupal 8, 9, and use the Tome module, and then connect it directly to Netlify and deploy the website through Netlify.
Yeah, I'm not sure which module I was thinking of then, because there was one that was Drupal 7 only.
If you go to stephencross.com and look at presentations, I got a few of them out there on Tome. And I go through examples in those presentations of actually how to deploy a Drupal site with Netlify using Tome.
Okay. Yeah, I might consider that too. But again, I'm looking at just, maybe migrating some of those clients using some sort of static generator, whether it's Jekyll or Tome or something that, I can just do some minimal styling for, so that, it doesn't become a security issue. They kind of just, their site can just live on forever without having to worry about, managing infrastructure or security updates anymore.
Yeah, static sites are great. Mike, what's new with you this week?
So one of the things, it's not personally for me, but so there's a YouTube channel I follow called Steve Mold, and he does a science video every Tuesday. And last week, what he did, he built a water computer. So it's basically a full adder for he made it so he can add two 4-digit binary numbers. So basically, what he uses water and tubing to add two 4-digit binary numbers, which he creates AND gates and OR gates, exclusive OR gates. There's a fun YouTube video about it because it's a YouTube channel. And what I liked about it was I watched it, and it's been so long since I've thought that deeply of like, how do you add binary numbers together? How does like the actual circuits work and like the adders work? And watching it in water is really simplified and brought me back to thinking like Drupal's like a water park, like just like there's so much so much water involved, right? So it was just really cool to watch how like logic literally flows through his computer to add two binary numbers together. And I like that a lot. So I was taking that and I was trying to build my own binary adder in Google spreadsheets just to see if I could do it, replicating it. So that, and then researching this episode today, I found out that New Relic has a upcoming conference that's free to go to called Future Stack. It's happening at the end of May, and included with it is a 24-hour hackathon, and like they have options for like doing no code solutions, so, like what can you build in a spreadsheet and things like that. So I'm signing up to do that at the end of May.
That's
Very
great.
cool.
I love Mike has a love of spreadsheets.
I love spreadsheets.
He's really good at all things spreadsheets. So it does not surprise me that he's finding more ways to integrate them into daily life.
A future Talking Drupal show should be like spreadsheets with Mike. Right.
I have a whole session on making magic with spreadsheets. So
that's awesome. Hey, so speaking of New Relic, David, welcome again this week. And like, what's new with you this week?
Yeah, well, this week, so I was supposed to take this week off for a camping trip, but the camping trip kind of fell out, didn't happen for reasons beyond my control, but that's okay. I still had the week off. So I'm just taking the week off and kind of catching up on spring cleaning, some digital spring cleaning as well, kind of rearranging my office and kind of getting things comfy. But I've also been using this time to sort of research and experiment for an upcoming project that I'm sort of leading at Pantheon, revolving around Twitch streaming. So I'm trying to figure out like how to get into it, maybe do like a talk show type situation on Twitch, maybe do some coding examples and some like build challenges and things like that. So that is going to be up and coming. I think it's going to start in June.
Would that be like in addition to those weekly videos, like webcasts you do?
Well, yeah. So we do every week. We do the live workshops, which are various training workshops for getting started with Pantheon. But those honestly haven't been getting a ton of attendance. So we're not dropping them, but we're starting to experiment with other things and see if maybe we can get traction or engagement in some other ways.
Interesting.
Very
John,
interesting.
John, what's new with you?
So not too much, but I do have I had an interesting question today, and I'm gonna pose it to the panel here and see if you guys have any insight into this, right? So had a client who is running an e-commerce store and basically needs to create UPCs for all of her products, right? And they didn't previously have UPCs, so kind of went down the rabbit hole of investigating like UPCs and how they differ from SKUs and like how you would go about like creating them or obtaining them, I guess is a better term. And turns out there are services out there you can use that are kind of pricey. But I was wondering if anybody else has ever had experience with UPCs in the aspect of assigning them to products or linking them to
So
products.
John, backing up a little bit, you said UPC versus SKUs. So a SKU is an internal number that only the company knows about. A UPC is a global identifier for a product.
Correct. So SKU stands for stock keeping units, which again, as Steven said, is internal. UPC stands for, hold on a second, it's here somewhere.
universal something code.
Universal, yeah.
Universal
Product code?
maybe?
Product
so.
code.
Sounds right. So basically, as you identified them, that is like in versus external.
So I imagine there's like a domain registrar, like for internet websites. That is the place you register these for.
It's a little bit messier than that. In fact, it's a lot messier than that.
The government basically, I think, has a database of like, hey, here's the product, here's the UPC code, and like everybody uses the same database.
Mm-hmm.
I think where the struggle is right now is we got tons of products and none of them have UPC codes. So now we have to go look up like 35,000 products to figure out what the UPC code is. So we're trying to find somebody to do that.
Can't you? My understanding, can't you buy like a bulk number of them? Yeah, a block of UPC codes, and then you just like iterate after one after the other. Yeah,
it gets really complicated though, because I do have experience with looking into this. Like I have a client that resells things, and so like for example, some brands don't allow them to use the original UPC, but because they're regenerating a UPC for like each individual item, it's basically a one-off item. So it gets really expensive sometimes to do bulk generation or lookup. And then you can't always use the same exact UPC for the same product because it's universal, but sometimes they're tied to particular companies.
Yeah.
So you can't use like, baby shampoo from Johnson & Johnson might have a different UPC at Target than Walmart. And so some vendors are like, oh, go ahead, use it. A lot of vendors though are like, you can't use our UPC.
Because it's internal to their organization.
So the UPC doesn't identify just the product; it identifies where you purchased it from.
It can.
It doesn't have to.
So, like for example, product comes in, gets assigned a UPC, and then Target could say, "Hey, we're gonna add our like brand specific UPC or change it to our brand specific UPC."
So this explains when I walk into Best Buy and I pick up a product and I want to scan it on my Amazon app to see if I could get it cheaper somewhere else.
Yep.
That UPC number doesn't find that product that I know is a generic product, but I can't find it on Amazon.
Yep. That's one of the reasons.
Sometimes.
That's also why Amazon will generate new UPCs now when they do a sale, because it makes like history tracking hard. And then there's another number, I think called GTINs, which sometimes work for more online stuff. But yeah, it's a murky world. It's a murky world. It's a huge hassle sometimes to figure out exactly what you need to do.
So John, you've turned a weekly update into a show that we need to talk about UPCs.
I mean, I guess so. Just an example here, and then we'll move on. Like,
all right, please.
Rabbit hole, right? So if you go to gs1us.org, there like seem to be like the organization for UPC procurement, I guess, based on my limited, very shallow amount of research. So to get 1 to 10,000 UPCs like generated, it looks like it's about $6,500. So it seems rather expensive, which I mean, it could be kind of labor intensive, I suppose. But anyway, that's where I'm at right now, trying to figure out the world of UPCs. So if you know anything about that, feel free to reach out.
All right, let's move on to New Relic. So David's joining us today. Third time. Welcome, David. Just to be clear, David is not necessarily an expert at New Relic. He is a trainer who works with Pantheon regarding New Relic. So I want to be clear that maybe we're not going to answer all your New Relic questions or our questions today. But we're going to talk about what the heck is New Relic. So I've had access to it in a number of hosting services that I've used, and it was never really clear to me the difference between New Relic and some of the other analytics services I'm using for my website. So hopefully we can figure that out today. So let's start with, what is the elevator pitch for New Relic? What is it?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So New Relic is really best thought of as a diagnostics tool. When you think about it as being able to diagnose performance problems or identify issues with performance that are happening on your website. And then long-term, you can set up alerts and notifications and incidents so that you are notified if those sorts of problems happen again. So it helps you fix problems, or not really fix problems, it helps you diagnose the problems that you might be having right now, and then be aware of any future problems that come up.
So where does this fit in with other analytics?
So New Relic is really trying to answer the question of like, how do the anonymous people on your website feel about the performance of your website? So, it's not like Google Analytics where it's going to tell you, where people are visiting your site from, or who they are, or, even like what pages they're visiting necessarily. It's all about how long does it take for the server to respond to a specific request and what makes up the specific request.
So you mentioned that it's anonymous users, but my understanding is when I've integrated with New Relic in the past, that there's some package that lives on the server. Is there a reason why it's restricted to just anonymous users and not authenticated users as well?
No, I apologize. I misspoke. It's not just for anonymous visitors.
Okay.
So yeah, logged in people as well can will still show up in the logs.
Okay,
yeah, I've used
cool.
As a Pantheon customer myself who has access to this, I've used it to check out the performance of my site and what's causing the most, using the most time, taking the most time to execute. So what's the difference between New Relic APM and their other services such as Browser and Synthetics?
Yeah, great question. So at Pantheon, everyone gets access to New Relic APM Pro for free, unless you're on the basic tier. So including the sandbox tier, and then all the performance tiers and everything above. And New Relic APM really stands for Application Performance Monitoring, and that refers to the performance that the application container that is running PHP and Nginx is. What is it doing? What is running on there? What services are going on, and all of that stuff. So it's monitoring the performance of the container that's actually running your site, or containers if there's multiples. The other services that New Relic offers, and they offer a lot. The other most popular ones is you also get access to New Relic Browser, which is probably best thought of as the front end performance of your website. You're going to get the actual rendering time of the page, how long it takes for images to load in, and things like that. So if you open up like Google Chrome Inspector or something and look at the waterfall of how your website loads, how long it actually takes to spin up, that's what you're going to be seeing with New Relic Browser.
So I guess one question I have here then for distinction. So again, APM requires something installed on the container or the server that's running. So it's seeing so it's seeing the requests in the memory and all that kind of stuff. The front end side, though, something actually has to make a request to see how the front end renders. Is the browser one a bit more periodic? So like every 10 minutes or every minute they hit your server and give you those statistics, or is there some other way it's measuring how long the page is loading?
My understanding is that it's still based on actual visits to the website, and
okay.
I honestly don't know exactly how it's being monitored, since there's lots of conditions, lots of variables that can go into each individual's setup and whatnot. But I'm going to be completely honest, I could be wrong about that. But my understanding is you'll continue to see the traffic that kind of is in line with what you would see with APM.
Oh, okay. So it's still live. Do you know if you can tie a particular session together both on the front end and back end, or?
You mean with APM and with Browser?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can tie them together, but if you look at the graphs, you can see individual like spikes that happen at the same time. So I think they correlate, but I don't know if you can actually like formally connect them in any way.
Interesting.
Can't blame your users, Nick. Like that guy has something wrong with his computer. That's why my site doesn't work right.
Well, I mean, it's more of like a front end request is causing a back end congestion or something like that. I think would be more interesting. Or like clearing the cache is causing it in both places. You could tie it together to the person that hit the person, that hits the cron job. You can see that, hey, that front end request takes forever and also causes all these cascading problems. But
yeah, well, that brings up an interesting misconception that people have when they go into New Relic APM and they're trying to diagnose their issues is that APM is really only looking at uncached responses,
Right.
whether it's the cache expired, it has to be regenerated, or like you said, someone logs into the website or something like that. Because I don't know if this is true for elsewhere. It probably depends on your setup, but at least on Pantheon, any cached response is being routed through our global CDN. So those responses never actually touch the container that's running your site unless it has to communicate for some reason. So as a result, APM won't show those cached responses by default.
I think when I first moved on to Pantheon and started using New Relic, I had those sort of misconceptions. I wasn't sure exactly what it was showing me and what it wasn't until I took the time to learn more about it and how I could use it.
Isn't the point being that it's server side? Right.
Yeah, I mean, if it never gets to the server, then of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a common misconception for sure.
Yeah. So if a CDN is serving up the content, New Relic on the server side doesn't know about it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So nothing would make it.
Well, actually, now that I think about it, the front end measurement has got to be some sort of JavaScript.
Right.
That piece, which means that the CDN that could still fire if it's being served from the CDN. But I haven't used the browser tool, so the browser feature, so I can't speak to that definitively. So what about synthetics?
Yeah, so New Relic Synthetics, I feel like like many areas of New Relic, there are so many variables and options and various data that you can track in different ways. Synthetics is made up of a lot of those things, but my sort of simplified way of thinking about it is you can use it really well as a sort of super powered global ping test. So you can get pings from all over the world and see how your response time might be from each of those locations to see if, hey, my visitors in this particular area that I care a lot about suddenly are getting a worse ping. Let's see if maybe we know why, or if there's anything we can do to influence that. But then also you can set up alerts. I mean, we can talk about this in a minute, but you can set up alerts for monitoring anything that you can imagine in New Relic and then get notified based on those. So we have lots of people that will use New Relic Synthetics specifically set up for sort of like uptime monitoring. Let's ping on a regular basis and let's get notified if the ping ever fails for some reason. Coincidentally, some people actually use that for sort of more customized cron schedules as well. If you want to ping a website on a regular basis, you could use that for that as well.
Interesting. That sounds useful, actually.
So, overall, like New Relic has a bunch of, sounds like a bunch of cool features, right? We can do performance monitoring, front end performance, the ping test uptime monitoring as you suggest. I'm wondering, what's appealing to Drupal developers, or why should Drupal developers really care about New Relic?
It's another great question. So let's say that I built you a website. Let's say I'm just building another talking Drupal website, and I show it to you, and you load up the page, and you count and count. And it's still loading, and 10 seconds later, it finally loads. You probably wouldn't be very happy with that. I wouldn't be very happy with that. At that point, the visitors, the people we're actually trying to attract to the website, would also be sort of put off and go elsewhere, probably. Mm-hmm. So there's obviously some sort of a performance problem, and New Relic is great at catching those problems. So, kind of going in and checking before you actually take a website live, making sure that custom code you wrote, or if you wrote like a custom query, or your views are kind of configured in a way that's efficient and good for performance. So it's really good at identifying those, oh, why is this thing suddenly taking like 3 times as long as anything else that's related to it? Let's go and start looking at that and digging deeper. So,
I mean, it essentially gives you, it pinpoints where your issue might be, right? So you write some code, you throw it up on your server, and then you notice your analytics is saying like your performance is taking a hit, right? it gives you, if I'm understanding you, it gives you that ability to pinpoint like, hey, is it coming from the code? Is it coming from the database? Is it coming from something completely different that I'm like not even aware of?
Right.
Those are I think the two most useful things that came out of it for me. One, it will show you it like aggregates, because it's always watching, so it will show you the slow queries.
Nothing creepy.
So it
about
helps. So it helps you see, like, if it's a particular view or query that's just hanging up in MySQL. But it also can many times just point out which Drupal function is being called. So like if it is custom code, it'll say, hey, anytime this function gets called, it takes 5 seconds to process. So then you're not just saying like, hey, I just released something is slow, so I think it's that. You can actually see, what is executing when it's running a slow load time, and then you can, follow that chain. Because sometimes making a change in one place actually affects a completely different part of your code, and New Relic will point that out, which will save significant time debugging.
It'll even break it down, like you said, by Drupal views, by Drupal hooks, by Drupal modules. Like,
Yeah.
I have my New Relic open right now, and like I can see for the slowest average call time for a Drupal hook for my site is a node view being called. It takes 168 milliseconds. Like the next one is entity insert, which is only 26 milliseconds.
So
the other nice thing too is it has a pretty nice time-based search, where a lot of tools sometimes it's difficult to find stuff. So, you don't always notice right away when there's a performance thing that's introduced. With New Relic, you can see when it was introduced too. So if somebody says, hey, I noticed the other day that this page is loading a little slow, you load up New Relic, kind of trigger a couple of hits, find out, oh, hey, this query or this function is causing that slowness. When did it start? And then you can kind of look at the history and be like, oh, okay, 2 weeks ago, something happened. And then you can kind of correlate, hey, what did we release 2 weeks ago? This is probably the culprit. So it's more than a lot of tools. I find it's very easy to quickly narrow down at least where you're searching.
So, David, Pantheon does hosting for both Drupal and, yes, dare I say it, WordPress sites. Just out of curiosity, I know Mike was just talking about kind of understanding which hook is performing slowly. Is New Relic just a tool for Drupal sites, or could you use it on a WordPress site or, some other sort of website?
Yeah, I mean, it works just as well on a WordPress site. Instead of getting insight into individual Drupal modules, it's WordPress plugins. You still get to see functions and everything else. I mean, obviously not views, but you still get the same level of insight into a WordPress website. And I haven't used it with too many other websites, but I know from looking through their sort of learning portal, they have a support for I would imagine any sort of web application you could think of.
Interesting.
A few weeks back, we had a show about Lighthouse, which we were looking at the analytics from the browser side of performance. Like, I'm looking now at that New Relic gives the answers to the backside of that same equation, right? Is when we were looking at Lighthouse and you have these pages that are loading slow, New Relic is the place that could answer those questions on why those pages are loading slow, or that network information is not what you want it to be.
Yep, exactly. Although I think something that Mike said a moment ago can also often catch people off guard. And he mentioned the response time being in milliseconds. I think a lot of people will go, again, it's a misconception between browser and front end, load times and what's actually happening on the server side. But you open up New Relic and you say, okay, it says that my website loads in, let's say half a second or, a second or something like that. How come when I open my browser, it's now something more than that? And we have to remind them that, well, we're talking about the website and it's how it's actually loading. It's on the server, not the browser.
There are things happening, and then it goes through a really small tube to get to your house.
Exactly.
All of those things take time.
Right.
So what other kind of information does New Relic provide information on? We've talked kind of at a high level. What are some specifics?
I mean, just about anything you can imagine regarding the performance of, what's going on in your server. When you first open up New Relic and you click on in Pantheon, your environment, the live environment, because you get it for every environment. You can see like the overall response time for each request, and that gets broken out by like database queries and PHP and things like that. You can also go in through, we've talked about database queries and how are those kind of contributing to things as well as a lot of the Drupal specific things that we've already mentioned as well. So, all of this information can be sort of dissected and broken down in lots of different ways and generated into many different reports and alerts. I'd say like one of the most useful that I've seen, and something that we recommend basing some of these alerts on, is actually something that New Relic refers to as an Apdex score, which is sort of like how satisfied are people with a specific response, that your site's generating. So you kind of have to see what a normal response time is for your website. You set that as they call an Apdex T, which is just the Apdex threshold. And then once you have a threshold in place, you can say, well, if the threshold is met, if it comes in within that threshold or below, people are satisfied, you get a good score. If it comes in, I think up to like 4 times your threshold, then people are very happy and you get a 0 score. And then it takes the average over time, it generates the Apdex score on an ongoing basis. And then you can use that to generate incidents, which can kind of go on to be alerts or, based on whatever conditions you specify. But then that can also go on to generate other really useful things like transaction traces. When you're in this sort of alert incident mode, you can actually view a trace of what happened under the hood for that specific slow query or that response, and then actually get information about what triggered that and what specific piece of your site is responsible for that slowness.
So how accurate do you find Apdex scores are? I imagine, helping with trainings and stuff, we probably see a lot of different websites with a lot of different scores. Do you find like it's generally tracks with what you would expect? A really high score is bad and a really low score is good, or do you find that you kind of have to learn your site specifically to know what's good and what's bad?
No, I mean, every website's different, and even, a average threshold that you might set, an average threshold for the response time for a Drupal site is probably different than a WordPress site, which is different than a static site, which is, on and on. Actually, static site may not be a good example, but you know what I mean. And even, within that, one very simple Drupal site that doesn't have a whole lot going on is probably going to have a much lower response time, much faster than a more complicated one. And so you kind of have to know what the response time is going to be and set that as your threshold. And then that controls, the Apdex score and how accurate that number actually is. But I'd say on average, most people don't even know that exists. The default in New Relic is just half a second, which again, might be appropriate for some websites, but I think from my experience, most Drupal sites are going to be more than half a second response time, but it depends. Yeah. And, there are things you can do to influence that over time.
What would you say is the average for a Drupal site?
I mean, it changes so much. I can't imagine a specific, like no specific number comes to mind off the top of my head, because I've done some New Relic training for some of our customers in the past, and some of them have been exceptionally slow, and that's normal. And there's a lot going on, and there's good reasons for that. And so it varies quite a bit.
Can you talk a little bit about the transaction traces? Do you find, customers of Pantheon have trouble kind of digging into what they are, or do you find that they're kind of intuitive once people realize what they are and able to kind of dig in and find where the issue is?
I think most people also don't know that they exist. Once you discover, my site had an alert or an incident, something was going on because I see the peach colored background on the graph. And I go into that and I can click on it. And there's a layer sort of in the list of panels that exist in the, for a specific transaction, a section where it says transaction traces. And once you click on it, then I guess I haven't taken a moment to ask if it's intuitive. But the way that it's laid out is there's all this levels, sort of transaction times with the one in red that is the slow one. And it's usually significantly higher than everything else. And you click on it and it drills down and it shows more. And then you click on the next layer and it drills down and you just keep going. And we actually
Yeah,
had a demo that we put together for training at one point where we put a like Twitter embed or something in the sidebar of our website in a block, and then we added some sort of a function to say like, delay, like don't do this for 5 seconds or 10 seconds or something to simulate, maybe the Twitter API is down or something. And then when you go into New Relic and look at it, it generates a transaction trace. You click on it and you can see, okay, something on the front page is slow. Something in the sidebar of the front page is slow. Something in the Twitter block of the sidebar of the front page is slow. And then all the way down to that specific function that says, hey, wait 5 seconds.
Yeah. See, the reason why I ask is I remember when I first started using New Relic, I stumbled on that at one point and realized, oh my God, this shows exactly what I need to fix. But then for the next like month or two working with it, like I could never remember how to get there. Like it was always like a hunt and click to find, okay, I know I need to click on one of these options to get to that useful page.
Right.
And I was just curious if other people kind of had the same experience.
Yeah. Well, let me share you two places. I mean, okay, full disclosure, like the New Relic interface is changing, like it seems like weekly. They're putting out updates and things are moving around. But whenever I go to look for it, often on the dashboard, if there are any active alerts or incidents, the transactions are right there. But you can always go to the sidebar and go down to the actual section for transactions, click on a specific and in New Relic, a transaction is really referring to like a specific page visit, so something like index.php, kind of boring, but that's what it is. And then like redirects and a landing page you might have set up, or something like that. And you click on one, and then within that section, there's a panel for transaction traces to dig deeper.
So this made me think, like I was looking at mine and like the scoring, I haven't updated it, so it's at that 0.5 seconds, but I have a pretty good score, which is great. But paying attention to the transactions and your scores, what other key data points would you say it's good for Drupalists to pay attention to or to utilize in New Relic?
Yeah, well, so real quick, before we move on, one more thing about what you just said. So if you are getting a good score, that's great, as long as it's accurate.
Right, exactly.
If you're missing out on potential things that are that you want to be notified about, then that also means that you're not generating a transaction trace, because those are generated based on when there is a failing score in a response. When a specific response fails by being 4 times your threshold, that's what actually generates the transaction trace. So if it's all working, that's great. You're good to go. But in some cases, for debugging purposes, you can actually set your aptX score or your threshold very low to intentionally trigger more transaction traces and see, what's actually happening under the hood.
So David, so I'm clear here. Your score is based on what you've defined as success.
Correct.
Okay. So by default, if Mike hasn't modified anything, he's going by whatever the default configuration was.
That's correct.
Just half a second.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So if it's half a second, that would mean that you'd only get transaction traces on loads that were more than 2 seconds.
Correct. Yep.
Right.
2 seconds or more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Super interesting, because I get a bunch of emails from New Relic for various sites, and they all have like the grid with the aptX scores in them and everything, and I'm always like, this looks pretty good. Like, sure,
It's green.
It's green. Or wait, this went up a second. What's going on here? Like, I have to talk to somebody about this. So,
John, has that turned into noise for you? Like that you don't look at it? Like a lot of these tools turns into a lot of noise. Like you get lots of emails, lots of information coming in. And I feel like sometimes you just get numb to getting these notifications that don't mean anything. And then you ignore it when it's important.
No, I would say quite the opposite, because typically what's happening is the email is just one data point, but I also have insight into the team who's working on maybe a performance problem. And to be able to see the email come in and have that score go down, because it kind of gives you like a month over month, like, hey, we're down this much from last month, or we're up this much from last month or week, or whatever the interval is. Yeah. So typically it gives you like some insight into like, okay, well, the team's doing things and they're working because we're trending, our things are loading faster, performance is better. Great. Awesome. And then you kind of have that barometer to say like, as they're working, oh, okay, things are, performance is getting worse. The time is going back up. So like, we have to look at this again and figure out what's going on. So
hey, David, could you talk a little bit about setting thresholds to make notifications be more useful or make people act on them?
Right. I mean, I think you make a good point, Stephen. I think a lot of people don't share John's perspective or maybe investment in the particular project. I certainly know back when I was kind of running my own small agency that I would have New Relic alerts going all the time because my sites were in Pantheon, and I didn't customize the threshold because I didn't know any better. And so I'd be constantly getting alerts, and eventually I would just choose to ignore them, or I'd set up a filter and be like, maybe I need this someday, but I don't want to see it right now, or I want to be distracted. So really going in to set your threshold to be something appropriate. Again, looking at your average response time over the course of whatever context you define, and then setting that to be your threshold is really the best way to do that. But there are lots of additional settings that, I mean, even I haven't gotten into with New Relic for when these incidents are generated, and then specifically what actually triggers a notification. So you can even say things like, notify me if my aptX score drops below a 0.5, which is pretty bad, or notify me if I have a sustained score of less than 0.85 or something. And so you can go in and customize that and tweak it to be the most useful for whatever you're trying to get out of it.
Interesting. So I don't need to get all of the alerts all the time. I can only get them when there's something catastrophically wrong going on.
Right. Or whatever you find useful. If you enjoy or you appreciate seeing what you're seeing right now, then it might be okay.
Yeah. I mean, I clearly don't mind it, but less email is always good. So, you might want to go in and tweak that thing. So, we talked about obviously performance issues and like looking at where we're having performance issues. But David, I'm wondering if you can give us some insight into other instances when a Drupal developer should look at New Relic for insight.
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of them. I mean, specifically because New Relic gives you insight into each module and each function, it can be really helpful for people that are writing their own modules as well. It can be easy to go in and kind of blame a slow module or whatnot, but if you get insight into your own code, then that can also be really, really revealing. And so in some cases, you might click around on your website to kind of generate some traffic or whatever, or you could hit it with a load test or something to start getting even more traffic to give you more insights into what's going on. Beyond that, like writing a custom module, then certainly, if nothing else, making time for this at the end of a project, I think is something that's often, at the end of the project, you often don't have budget anymore to kind of do the extra things, but nobody wants a slow website. So taking the time to invest into, let's do a load test. Let's, go into the environment that's not the live one, not the production one, of course, and set it up and set up New Relic and make sure it's functioning properly, set an aptX score for what you would expect it to be, or maybe actually set it very low so you get all the information. Yeah, that's better. And then just hit it with traffic. At Pantheon, we typically, like at a certain tier, you're given someone on your team, a CSM, that helps you make sure that your launch is going to be successful and like there's no hiccups and no surprises and nothing like that. And as part of that, we typically will go through and say like, let's look at 4 times, or actually, I think it's 10 times what your average traffic is right now. Let's hit the test environment with that amount of traffic with New Relic, see how it performs, see how everything stands up, make sure that the plan that we've specified for you is appropriate and going to work and going to be good for everything long term. And then also taking a look at the transaction traces and, kind of giving that information back to see if there's anything else that could be improved before going live.
Two things come to mind there. Like, I think you talked about it at the end of a project, but I imagine it would probably be pretty good when adding a new major feature to a project, right? To be able to test like, hey, did we impact performance by adding these 6 modules and this custom code, and
Right.
this major feature, or like, are we just keeping the status quo?
Exactly. Yeah. Nobody likes performance regression. Nobody wants to make their website slower in any condition. So
like, hey, that feature works great, but now our website loads in 10 seconds. That's not going to work, not going to fly, right?
Exactly.
And then the other thing that comes to mind, and you mentioned this a couple of times, is using New Relic in conjunction with load testing. So, that's something that, I am sure most of us are familiar with, the idea of load testing, but never actually thought of using New Relic as an assistive technology there.
Yep. It is perfect for this sort of thing. Yeah. And
now,
actually, as part of what kind of in this similar sort of vein, something else that can be really helpful. We mentioned earlier that it can be helpful for debugging and, as you're about to release a new feature, for example. This is not specific to Pantheon, but something that's really cool. It's easy to do in Pantheon is actually put a line in your New Relic graph signifying exactly where each commit in each deployment is. Because then if you are having a performance issue and you kind of just want to see, like, show me exactly where this code actually changed, you get this nifty little line right on the graph, and then you can hover over it and it'll even show you, the commit or not the commit message, I think, but at least the deploy UUID or something. So you can go back and figure out exactly what was changed at that moment.
So then you can run git blame.
Exactly.
Nick always wants to blame somebody. It's either the
and it's going to be it's going to be me.
Guy writing the code, or always blaming somebody.
I don't need to run git blame to know it was me.
So that's actually interesting, because one of my questions was going to be if you could mark, like, when you're doing your stress test or your load test, where you start and where you finish, so that way you have kind of that baseline or that data for later. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole level of automation that you can reach into with Pantheon. I mean, we have a tool named Quicksilver, which really just lets you run scripts before or after any workflow that happens on the dashboard. And so this New Relic, forget exactly what it's called, but we just have an example script where you literally just put it into your folder for Quicksilver, and then it just runs after every commit or after every deploy or whatever conditions you specify. And there are some people that will actually set up other automated tests to run in conjunction with that. So you could say, if I'm really concerned about performance, every time I deploy to test, let's add a line on the graph, let's run a load test, and then you'll always have that information visible in the test environment for New Relic.
I have some homework now for additional automation things. For myself.
Yeah, I can put some links to that in the show notes for later too.
So is the aptX T you mentioned here in the show notes, aptX T, is that setting that threshold time for when alerts should be generated?
Not for when alerts will be generated, but for how your aptX score is actually scored.
Calculated. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And one question that I had that clients often have for me is, New Relic is something running on your server, and depending on what products you're using, some JavaScript running on the actual website as well. Does it have an impact on performance? Is there a way to say, hey, only run on like 10% of the queries, don't, so it has less impact, or is it kind of seamless?
It's pretty seamless. I don't have any direct experience kind of debugging these things, but I've been told and been asked many times about this, and no, it doesn't affect the performance at all.
And Nick, yeah, I doubt that's your customer's question. I think that's your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, I have had no. I work with a lot of agencies, so they certainly ask those kinds of questions. I mean, the thing is, the reason why I asked too is I always get that answer too, that it doesn't. But it's like measuring something affects. Yeah, exactly. It has to have some sort of effect. Right. I've never seen a noticeable effect, and the benefits far outweigh any effect it would have. But I've always been curious at how they measure that with having such a small effect.
It's always analytics, so that measurement is always injected into every measurement. So, like, does it really matter, right? if the cost of doing that measurement is part of every measurement, then it doesn't really matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's probably what it is. Yeah, like it's a constant bias. So
yeah. Thank you. Okay. So for our listening audience, David, it's mostly Drupal or all Drupal people. So what are the most common issues you think that New Relic could help people solve? Like, what are the top 2 or 3 things that
honestly, I think it's the things that most people probably already expect. I mean, use and database queries in general are known for being relatively slow for the most part. And I think when I've went in and done the New Relic training, for our private customers and whatnot, like I can't go into any specific examples, but it frequently amounts to, every time I visit this page, this view under the hood has to run to update something else that's going on. And there's just a really slow query because there are hundreds of thousands of, pieces of content it has to sort through, or, occasionally maybe the view is just done in a way that's really inefficient. And maybe you'd want to rewrite that as something like manual, maybe. But again, like New Relic isn't trying to solve your problem. It's just trying to point in the direction of your problem so that you can kind of come up with your own solution.
Your product display view with 100,000 items is running slowly. Go fix it.
Right. Or for me, back in the day, I built a lot of calendars, and calendars are just incredibly difficult to get to cache and work correctly with events that are changing and updating all the time.
Do you have any insight into maybe the amount of if somebody's never used New Relic before, they go through the training and start looking at it? Do you have any idea of like what kind of performance gains people generally see relatively? Like obviously some people are going to go from 10 seconds to 6 seconds. Some people go from 4 to 3, but do you think everybody finds something that they didn't realize was affecting performance and are able to fix that? Or is it, is that kind of client to client too?
That's a really complicated question. I think it's very contextual. It depends, I think, partly on the complexity of the website, as well as how comfortable an individual is with reading the data and understanding, where things are coming from, because the interface is extremely intimidating, because there are so many graphs and so many different, key metrics and data points and things like that, that when I first went into it, I just kind of nodded my head and said like, yep, it looks okay to me, I guess, and kind of moved on from there. But if you know what you're looking for and you set, kind of the baseline, threshold, and, you're trying to debug a specific problem, then it can be pretty significant. But I don't have a specific thing where it's like, oh yeah, on average, you'll save 5 seconds.
I think it also is a little bit of he who seeks will find, right? If you're looking to find ways to improve the site, New Relic is a way to find those answers.
It's very biblical.
And if you don't look for it, you'll never find it.
Yeah. So one thing comes to mind right now as we're talking about like slow views and looking into New Relic and the information you can get in there, right? And we, Drupal is moving in a a decoupled sort of architecture. Will New Relic help you look at JSON queries and those sorts of endpoints for your site as well, to say like, hey, this endpoint could be more performant in, who knows, the way it's built or what have you?
My answer is going to be yes, but I can't go into any more detail than that because that's an area I haven't explored too much.
Sure.
But I know, we're starting to experiment, and we'll be rolling out a feature on Pantheon for doing decoupled websites later on, I think later on this year. So this is a topic that's going to become, even more popular internally, and maybe I'll have an answer for you in a few months.
All right. We'll follow you on the socials to keep apprised of that.
David, you had already mentioned previously that, you have, or Pantheon has some videos about how to use New Relic and explore the dashboard and whatnot. Do you have any other recommendations on how Drupal developers can learn more about how to use New Relic, or like training resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most useful one that I've found, and honestly, because New Relic is constantly changing and improving, and all of that. They're making things better all the time. Going directly to New Relic is probably the place that I would recommend. It's the one I recommend most. I think it's learn.newrelic.com. It's sort of their learning portal. They have sort of a gamification LMS type thing going on where you can watch the videos and dig in. But the one thing that's worth mentioning is New Relic is pretty big. There's lots of different areas. There's lots of products beyond APM that I've never heard of or really had any interest in getting into. And so the learning portal can be even more intimidating in some ways than New Relic itself, because you really have to start with a very narrow idea of like, what am I trying to get out of this?
This makes me just think real quick about the Future Stack conference that New Relic is having at the end of May, which could be helpful because it's all talks on New Relic. So
yeah, that's another great idea. I want to say that I've heard some New Relic talks at a Drupal camp or DrupalCon at some point, but nothing specific comes to mind.
Dave, as we start to wrap up here, I got one last question for you. So you're working for Pantheon. Pantheon is providing New Relic as a service. Does that come with every account for Pantheon customers, or is it a certain tier that you get to? How does that work?
Yeah, so when you spin up a site on Pantheon, you start at the sandbox tier, and you get New Relic at the sandbox tier. If you are getting benefits from it, if you want to keep using
free.
it,
that's free.
Yeah, the sandbox tier is totally free.
Okay.
You don't pay anything until you actually take your website live, connect your domain and kind of do all that stuff. The sandbox tier is entirely free, and you get New Relic. So you can use it, debug, migrate your site in, start debugging your issues, figure stuff out. If you decide that you don't really need the feature long-term, then you can go to our basic tier, which has limitations on amount of traffic and number of domains and stuff like that. But the basic tier does not include New Relic. But then every other tier beyond that includes New Relic. So it's on almost every single tier. But the important one, I think, is really mentioning that it's on the sandbox tier. So you can use it to debug your site, even if you don't eventually launch the site on Pantheon.
Great. Thank you. So if you have questions or feedback regarding this episode or any other one, you could reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can also hit us up on the Talking Drupal channel on the Drupal Slack, or email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can also get show notes and updates from our newsletter by going to talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Oh, can I add one more thing?
You can in a minute. Hang on there. We're not done yet. Nick, you're muted.
Nick's got to unmute himself. This is where the show usually falls apart. How about this? Because we're gonna probably. Are you gonna edit this? Because we can just go back and David can add his thing, and then we can do the outro.
So, David, what did you want to add? I
just wanted to add a quick reminder about our Twitch experiment that I mentioned at the very beginning in our introduction. We're going to be Twitching, hopefully having some cool interviews and chats, and maybe even some slide dissections where we talk through a presenter and kind of give them additional voice into what they were thinking on their slides. But that's going to be through our Twitch page. It's going to be twitch.tv/Pantheon Live. And then I'm also probably going to start Twitch streaming because I learn best by doing. And so I'll probably also be Twitch streaming. We'll put links to that in the show notes as well.
You can promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal, and you can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
So, David, thanks for joining us today. It was a great discussion. I think we've already discussed your promotions, but how can people contact you if they want to learn more about
me on Twitter? Is super easy. I'm at David Needham on Twitter. Otherwise, you can always email me, david.needham@pantheon.io.
Great. How about you, John?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, and you can find out about Oomph at oomphinc.com.
And Nick?
You can find me everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And Mike with his Ned Camp shirt.
Yeah, I got my Ned Camp t-shirt on. So you can find me there when we have them. You can find me on Twitter or on Drupal at Mike Miles 86, at my personal website, mike-miles.com, or my podcast website, developingup.com.
And I'm Stephen Cross, stephencross.com.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.